Alison and Peter Smithson present 3 urban form projects they designed for Hamburg and Berlin between 1957 and 1970. Underlying each of the 3 projects, they consider the ideas of continual urban renewal and change, of order and legibility in a city, of calmness, and of individual mobility and movement patterns. In 1957, Berlin organized an open international ideas competition for the destroyed central city. The Smithsons submitted the plan they had prepared in collaboration with Peter Sigmund and were awarded one of the 3 third prizes. They now describe that first plan.
The urban form of Berlin Hauptstadt was supported by 4 ideas. The concept of mobility, derived from observation of movement patterns and which is at the root of our work on urban structuring. The inverted profile developing out of the realization that pyramidal density patterns for city is too banal, outdated both by the size of city and by the means of which people wish to move about. Ideas to do with growth and change held in common with close friends in Team 10, to do with how we wish to occupy cities and what kind of places would suit our needs best. The need for green zones in cities, a constant theme running through the theoretical works of most urban idealists. The exact form these should take and how to support the whole is a matter of form giving, responding to, and reflecting the lifestyle of a culture.
In the Berlin Hauptstadt, our collaborator was Peter Sigmund, whose hand can be seen in many of the perspectives and in the most detailed axonometrics. It was a very simple plan in which the dominating idea was to give the motorist and the pedestrian equal rights to freedom of movement and freedom of access, a freedom communicated by the buildings themselves. In the main shopping zone there are 2 interrelated systems of movement. The various urban forms have 2 interrelated aesthetics. The pedestrian motorist shopper begins by using the street net at ground level, a street net largely as given by the Berlin engineers. The public transport pedestrian starts at the platform net at the 10-meter level, walking on top of the shops. The aesthetic of the cars is of low-speed straight streets with light-controlled right-angular intersections, and that of the pedestrians free-moving, non-parallel, narrowing and widening routes and angled junctions. The pedestrian upper-level platform net crosses the street net once between every street intersection, and at this point the 2 systems are connected by escalators. This escalator system makes for the practicality of the 10 meters above ground level of the platform net, for no one will use a flyover or a subway to cross a road if it involves extra effort. The way the shopping urban form works for the motorist would be that for casual parking, less than half an hour, places are provided in front of the buildings between small trees, and more or less give the character of the Champs-Élysées, allowing slow-speed window shopping on both wheels and on foot. But the motorist shopper who wants to buy, which is a different thing from shopping, he must go to one of the underground parking garages located on the main through streets, the Kanonierstrasse running north-south, the Leipziger Strasse and the Kolkstrasse running east-west. The pedestrian shopper might start at the northern tip of the platform, starting at the S-Bahn station or the city bus station. The 10-meter level of the upper platform is established by that of the level of the S-Bahn, and this platform grows down the old main spine of the economic city, down the Friedrichstrasse, and once south of the historic buildings along the Unter den Linden expands into a net, knitting the whole triangular zone between the old diagonal roads radiating northwest and northeast from the Marienplatz. The platform net within this triangular area forms elongated enclosures, clustering along the Friedrichstrasse, with less elongated enclosures elsewhere, such enclosures being allocated to specific use and given a specific shape for that use. Those nearest the outside of the shopping zone are more especially differentiated. The fashion district, the entertainment district, flower garden, flower market, which is a glass-covered place. And at the bottom, at the southernmost point of the triangle, the foot of the Friedrichstrasse, the platform net terminates the old Marienplatz with a helicopter station with all its attendant facilities. Except in these special areas, the usual use of the whole triangle is commercial: shops, restaurants, cinemas, with gaps through from one enclosure to another. And although the platform is shown as being 3 floors high, this is a nominal. For most big shops would tend to have only one high floor and perhaps a basement for servicing.
The urban forms of Hauptstadt Berlin had as their basis the idea of absolute maximum mobility, achieved by a layered movement pattern separating the various means of movement. In this case, it's difficult to pull apart the urban forms and the urban structure. Each urban form uses for its support a specific quantitative-qualitative combination of the means of movement which is the urban structure. These variations give to each part of the city its identifying texture. Speaking of use, attempting to make the city legible through the order of movement and the concomitant urban forms. The individual can experience a new freedom through using the means of movement. When the machine is sweetly used, it allows, and so engenders, consideration for others. Freedom by the removal of conditions that cause stress, an improvement of the air breathed as we move through our cities.
The platform level, the upper level, is kept in full pedestrian use by putting various things up there, some accessible only at this level, so that the platform becomes their terrassen, an external extension of their business. Other larger businesses are accessible from both the ground and the platform level. At points of maximum use, there are piazzettas dropped into an intermediate level between platform and ground, around which can cluster everything traditional to Berlin, from cafes to newspaper stands, either as small independent establishments or as part of a big shop. And where the platform crosses the street on bridges, there are similar shopping piazzettas surrounded by a gallery, again one level down from the platform level, which a pedestrian would take in coming up or down the escalator to the street. Thus, every street crossing is a kind of Rialto bridge.
In place of too many barely compatible things happening in the same place, the civilized separation of man and machine, so that a new exhilaration grows out of the calm urban form encompassing the meditated use of things and the perfected control of mechanism, makes for an inverted profile for a cogitative society that would be in control of its direction. Spaces need to be calm, urbane, even a little empty for this society. In the past in Europe, there have been large, restful patterns of palaces and attendant open spaces that we've come to appreciate as part of a revolt against the norm of speculative development, which demands dense piling up for financial reasons, with the realization of the open textured city as one of the gifts of greater mobility. Hauptstadt Berlin, cultural, governmental, commercial pleasure center, was here given an inverted profile of low density.
Riding above the platform in this area of low density are the small squarish towers, about 30 meters high. These towers rest on the ground, but become wider above the platform level to serve as administrative offices for any shop that has such needs. Or a tower can house the kind of shop that needs no shop window, such as a beauty salon. These towers have access and egress both at ground and platform level, and so add to the number and types of connections between the two systems. They're charging the system. All towers are attached to the north-south routes of the platform net and their presence indicates that you are in a true shopping area, and they cluster most intensely along the Friedrichstrasse.
The urban forms of the pieces of the low-profile city were intended to be anticipatory, open-ended within the rules that grew out of their interaction with systems of movement. This aided the consistency of each form, the conglomerate of all forms speaking of the likelihood of change, expectant of growth and variation, although the exact nature of these awaits hidden in the future. The feeling for change, the need for elbow room, for opening up so that buildings, roads and services can each develop freely according to their own law, and have the possibility of change without compromising the development as a whole, is central to the thinking behind the urban structure and the urban forms of Hauptstadt.
At its periphery, this low-level platform sends out connections, 3 major and a number of minor, to join up with the Anhalter Bahnhof on the southwest and to the Old City on the northeast, and more importantly to the northwest it sends out a major branch to the government building. The minor branches connect through the wall of offices to the Tiergarten as well as to the new green zones and to the surrounding city areas. The major connective branch on the platform which runs out to the government buildings is a processional approach to a great forum created around the Place de la République in the bend of the river. Here the platform widens out to hold terraced government buildings and encloses the old circular Platz at its southern grasp, finally rising in a series of tiers like the fingers of a grasping hand to form an amphitheatre. The approach to the Place de la République is under these tiers, and under the government buildings are the car parks and service areas. Officials and their visitors can look down from the terracing of the government buildings into the amphitheatre on national occasions. At the junction between the processional approach platform and the Parliament Forum is the press building, Israeli antennae television masts. Under the approach platform runs the road connecting the Parliament to the rest of the city.
Throughout our work, before and after Hauptstadt, we've thought about the plan which could present a non-rigid idea, a way of indicating by means of drawings a direction an urban form could take, open-ended drawings that are suggested of possibilities that might accrue or become obvious only when the first portion has been built.
Such a notion is that of the ministries. These buildings grow to their rear, stepping up behind the 2-story ministers' houses on the riverbank, so as the ministers' departments increase in size and become more anonymous, so does the building that contains them. They rise to a maximum of 45 metres and at the highest part touch the peripheral road from which the vehicular access is gained. The ministers and the high officials use the formal entries and parking spaces off a continuous quay on the north bank of the Spree to the Bellevue Schloss to opposite the Dom. This is, therefore, a general notion, a small thing attached to a pleasant place, and a bigger and bigger and more anonymous, more protected place attached to the noisy places, one thing growing into the other. The ministries, set out in their green zone, define the northern boundary of the Berlin Hauptstadt. There is, in a similar general way, a wall of offices rising to a height of 100 metres defining the shopping area. The wall is formed and located to minimise the shadow cast by its height. In that part of the green zone outside the wall of offices there is car parking for office workers and day shoppers and service areas, all hidden behind grass bunds and planted with trees. The green zone outside the wall of office is intended as a recreation gardens for office workers. The boundary theme continued around the city, around the original city, by an office wall which in the original city area becomes warehouses with service areas, loading bays and so on the back side. The shadows cast by all these buildings fall mostly onto roads or onto the S-Bahn. The original city nucleus has been consolidated by weaving between the existing buildings 3 new civic buildings, Most of the curved streets are retained in some form, and the area between these streets and the buildings is paved for short stay parking and for pedestrian access, as we did along the Friedrichstrasse. The new buildings are terraced and form well-lit dished spaces, their general aesthetic tying up with that of the government buildings. The other area, the area of Berlin's first settlement on the Fischerbruck, where many old houses remain, is preserved as the Berlin equivalent of Kasbah. Everything which remains is to be preserved as far as possible, and between the preserved buildings are new buildings arranged around courtyards, much as Ulm Cathedral Square. Whole quarter is treated rather romantically with a mixture of academies, pensions, tourist facilities and private houses.
When we came to visit Berlin after Hauptstadt, it was obvious that Berlin had what every other city in the world might envy, an open centre. Scharoun's answer to the same Hauptstadt competition had, with understanding, increasing meaning and value. In all other metropolitan cities, development pressures have brought about, or in the Arab countries are bringing about, a condition of overbuilding. They are all cities kept going by a vast deployment of mechanical devices, underground railways, lifts, escalators, a layering of activities one above the others, apartments, shops, services, parking, sustained by an equally vast deployment of air conditioning, ventilating equipment, pipework. For the ordinary user, enjoyment of the city tends to get squeezed out in the layers. Certainly the metropolitan cities have lost that sense of structuring and feeling for use which we associate with ordinary villages and towns. Space Berlin had. At that date, 1958, the open texture left by the destruction of the war would have been used positively, as Scharoun suggested, to allow building towards a new, expansive image of the metropolitan city.
In our plan, made before a visit to Berlin, the Tiergarten had been extended eastwards from the Brandenburger Tor along the Unter den Linden. A green wedge had been driven right through to the old Schloss. In this green wedge are the remaining historical cultural buildings. The Brandenburger Tor stands in the centre of a green space defined by two arms of the platform net stretching west. From these arms, various other cultural buildings are pendant.
Berlin, as it has in fact been rebuilt, is by the spotting down of buildings like single teeth in gaping mouths of city blocks. With Scharoun in the city, a policy should have been adopted of grouping buildings into substantial clumps around which servant facilities clustered. A city within a greater Tiergarten, flowing into the surrounding lakes and pine woods. The new image could have been worthy of its enforced role as a Sleeping Beauty island, a romantic place, worthy of West Germany having its heart there. In the Hamburg Staalschub, we again take up the same themes as in Hauptstadt Berlin. Mobility, inverted profile to the centre, urban form elements which would accept growth and change, preservation of the existing green spaces which are in Staalschub are the allotment gardens.
In this Wettbewerb Staalschub, made in 1961 for the Free and Hansestadt of Hamburg, our German collaborator was Wolfgang Quante. The roads in this project form the primary structure. Vehicles enter the site from one takeoff on the Schwarzeweg, the main road. Immediately north of this takeoff is the centre of the new community, the first place passed if entering by car, the first place stepped into as a pedestrian coming out of the U-Bahn, which also crosses on the line of the motorway, very close to the site. Through traffic passing along the Schwarzweg on the elevated level over the takeoff, seeing the particular form of the centre of the Stahlshoop has some experience of the identity of the community. The two side distributor roads to Stahlshoop were on its west and east side. Each road to the north stops short of the Alsdorf cemetery, which becomes a literal dead end. On both these distributors, as far north as possible, links are provided to adjacent developments, but not in such a way as to provide easy through routes. Off these main distributors are loop roads serving the housing areas. A special loop serves the centre. In all cases, it is perfectly clear what is the function of the road. Houses on the ground are related to the low-speed loop roads, the low apartment houses to the medium-speed distributors, and the high apartment houses to the Schwarzweg. All the houses on the ground car parking is sunk 1 metre below the natural ground level. Parking for the high-rise types is related to the vertical access points. The grouping of the housing reflects the geography of the site. South of the U-Bahn, there is also the domestic service and industrial areas, divided by the existing road system. 2 service roads have been provided to enable all industrial traffic to reach the Schwarzweg. That is, the industrial traffic doesn't get mixed up with the housing traffic.
Much is lost when houses on the ground are overlooked. This is the diagram of quietude. Furthermore, the question of housing type has to be seen at the scale of the city as a whole. A mixture that would give variety in a village would produce boredom at the scale of a big city. Here, the same housing type, houses with gardens, extend over a considerable area, the variety being adjustments within the housing type. All are close houses, keyed together to form their own covered pedestrian access route, arranged as if leafy branches on either side of a central green space. Every alternate green finger extending from the central space between branches being allocated for children's open play space, pedestrian ways through and between close houses, both covered and in the open, are linked to the complete pedestrian system. No child is to be taken across more than one residential road at the end of the close in order to make its way along the edge of the houses to the primary school and local shops. Linkages for perambulator pushers and bicyclists between branches of close houses take people to the schools and bodying out the centre.
At this point where the schools are, the Bramfelder Lake recreation area has been extended southwards via the central green space from the west end of the lake to the apex of the Stahlshoop U-Bahnhof, there is the centre. That is, the lake is brought until it meets the maximum point of intensity by the railway station. The central place forms a social focus of the whole group, combined business, social, educational, community centre, marketplace, and so on, lying across the highest part of the site. To the south of this place is the Bahnhofplatz, through which one enters the town by rail. To the north, the Schoolplatz, which is at a lower level, and then dropping away again, the green wedge to the lake, which is the wedge, the lake, the green strip, the schools, the centre, the U-Bahnhof. And it is here, in this central place, where these two systems touch, that the urban rural experiences at their most intense that is possible in the suburbs are experienced.
Most of the ancillary buildings, the shops and so on, are here gathered together to form one centre of events. Only this way could there be created a place with real intensity of character, its identity, as Stahlshoop comes from it being the place where all the ordinary outside of family activities come together. The schools, as the largest built volumes in the new district, contribute presence. By including the school's hard play areas, and the big auditoriums, large definite elements, one can take formal control of the space. And the schools benefit from parking space provided for the shopping, particularly at evening activity time. The cinemas, social buildings also benefit. Use throughout 24 hours justifies parking being covered by the marketplace, floor of which is concrete and glass, triangulated mesh to make the parking itself as light as possible. Thus the centre's on 2 levels. Cars and service access under the marketplace, above the marketplace, on the south side, ordinary shops at the north side, craft industry shops, all German things like furniture repair, shoe repair, and so on. Stores of all buildings, being at natural ground level, screen the parking and service area from pedestrians using the green space.
This notion of taking the largest built volumes, concentrating them at the centre, is an attempt in this very modest place to give a genuinely different experience from that which is obtained in the housing areas. The interchange, the 2 rail links into Hamburg, which come to this centre, we hope will add periodicity of custom for the shops, and also the fact that there are always people about is gives a sense of social control. They're being protected by vandalism, but without having policemen. At the extremities of the marketplace start the linked systems of access, the access decks of the apartment house type. This is accessed from decks, and there are flats and maisonettes, gardens on the ground, and the access systems branch out to penetrate into other housing areas, spanning the roads, so that the children can get safely to and from the green space in the schools. And the deck houses, which are closest to the marketplace on this system, and therefore closest to the shopping and buses and trains, are intended to be where old people could live. South of this deck house system, and set well back from the Schwarzweg, rise the curved terraced houses, again apartment houses, very tall. They're with wide terraces, raised private balconies and living rooms facing the sun and looking out to the towers and cranes of old Hamburg. Due to the configuration of the site, 2 of these terrace houses are on the west side of the centre, and these, together with a chain of deck houses, to build up an increased population. And on that side is the 3rd of the primary schools, and also a local shopping centre. The staging proposals are shown in a diagram, but more importantly, it was suggested in the report that after the second phase, that the whole thing should be reassessed, because our experience has been that one of the sources of tepidness in new towns and large suburban developments in England has been the fact that the people pressed on with the staging of the master plan and didn't take into account that once a physical fact had been established on the ground in the early phases, that the natural thing is to reciprocate, that is the new development, reciprocate with what already exists. So that it was the intention that this master plan shouldn't necessarily be thrown away after second stage, and a whole new assessment of the site should take place.
It is basic to the idea of being able to react to growth and change that it has supported the area or the housing group or the city or whatever it is supported by a mesh or a web of connective linkages. Places of intensity in the transport systems are likely to become the new fixes in our city because of the long-term investment involved. And these fixes will have to be given an urban form appropriate to their meaning in the whole city. If we examine interchange, it is a nodal event in a connective network where some amenity servant functions, waiting, eating, meeting, purchasing, have to be woven in with the nodal servant functions, car parking, taxi ranks, baggage handling, bus terminals, in such a way as to make clear and pleasurable what is going on and how one is expected to behave. All these things need space to make themselves clear and to work sweetly, and not be so tightly knitted up as to be individually or severally incapable of change. People have become inured to overcrowding. They tend to accept servicing facilities and circulation routes entirely below ground, permanently locked into the systems above, rendered inflexible. Yet it is fundamental to system building that subsystems should be capable of change. Both the needs of human use and of system growth demand space. More elbow room will be needed for the movement systems of the next half-century if they're not to jostle with buildings or compromise still viable areas.
You can see that we are regarding this modest centre in Hamburg as one of these fixed points. On our next project in Berlin, a cosmopolitan metropolitan city, was for a similar nodal event. This project, made in 1962 for the Mehring-Bluscherplatz, was commissioned by the senator from Bauern-Wohnungswesen, the same man who commissioned the Hauptstadt many years before. And people were asked, architects were asked, who had been prize winners in the previous competition. In this case, this project, our project, we used Gunter Nitschke as our German collaborator. Now, the Mehringplatz had been one of the three representative entries into the 18th century expansion of the Friedrichstadt, that is the Baroque city that arose at the side of the old Berlin. The Mehringplatz was a rondel, the Leipziger Platz an octagon, and the Pariser Platz a carré. As the city grew, in the 19th century, the Mehringplatz gradually lost its meaning as an entry point, and its power as an urban form was eroded by the poor buildings which came to surround its circular space. In the earlier Berlin Hauptstadt competition project, in this area of the Mehringplatz, we terminated our upper level free-ranging pedestrian system, and at the ground level we organized this antique entry point as one of the penetrations through the wall of offices which we surrounded the city with, so to retain something of its entry characteristics. But in fact, the function of to this area, we allocated the function of a helicopter station. What we are now being asked in this new commission by the Berlin Senate was to find a building form which the Mehringplatz asks for, that is, to discover if the historical form could be kept in a new situation. We had not previously considered the circular form as being something to which we should pay a lot of attention.
With the open-textured metropolis that could be in mind, the size of the building plots left by Berlin's official road layout we considered too small for the sort of development in which detailed traffic handling could be considered as part of the act of building. which mode we can still consider the only way to produce a truly habitable city. A way had to be sought to cushion the historic centre, that is the old Friedrichstadt, from even the possibility of too much pressure by the mechanisms of today. To attempt to keep the essence, if not the fabric, of the Baroque town idea intact, respect for the existing built sense explains the emphasis of the symmetry and the projected building group around the original axis. And our intention that vehicular movement to and from the buildings of the new Marienplatz should convey the sense of ease and elegance enjoyed walking between staircase and salon in a Baroque town palace.
We asked ourselves what would be the form of event at this place, a built event, through which one could sense the structuring of present-day Berlin as one could sense through the old Marienplatz, then called the Belle-Alliance-Platz, the structure of in Baroque times it was called that, and in the shape of that Belle-Alliance-Platz you could sense the structure of the Baroque plan. Since the time of the Berlin Hauptstadt project in 1957, West Berlin, divided from the east, had produced its plan for its own separate motorway system. That is, when we made the Hauptstadt project, the road pattern was an east-west, considered part of a possible reunified Berlin. In this new case, there was a separate system with a separate lot of statistics and traffic flow and so on. For the Berlin Wall had become a reality, passing across the end of the Friedrichstrasse to sever the destroyed Marienplatz from the main part of the triangle of the Baroque city, leaving the site, the notion of entry, devoid of meaning, as an entry into something that no longer existed. These two factors, the separate road system and the fact that there was now a wall, gave a new program base bearing no resemblance to the idea of the Hauptstadt as a capital of a united Germany. In response to the new set of circumstances, we proposed that the Marienplatz area became an event in a chain of events following the line of West Berlin's south tangential urban motorway. Such a chain of focal places, this focal places we're talking about was focal places in the Hamburg project, such a chain is a logical continuation of the natural tendency for the cultural and social urban events of Berlin to form east-west lines, which was the formal theme that Sharon followed in his Hauptstadt project. This tendency for the social events to go into east-west strings has been both frustrated and exaggerated by the division of the city into two. By extending the existing line of events eastwards from the Kurfürstendamm, which is one of these east-west strips, so as to act as social focus for the living areas Tempelhof and Neukölln, that is to the east of the Kurfürstendamm, east and south, one could begin to extend this existing chain of events to serve the zone through which the line of the south tangential motorway passes. In a way, the south tangential motorway is itself part of this east-west concentration. Along the motorway, identifying these nodes, identifying the Anhalter Bahnhof, the railway station, and the main technical school complex at Rund um die Kruschkirche. It is proposed to make on a continuous parking strip on both sides of the south tangential, which would vary in its capacity according to the things it was serving alongside the motorway. The motorway would have takeoffs, 650-meter intervals. At these points would be these nodal focal events, which were intended to both serve and to identify the areas to which you were connecting via the takeoffs of the motorway, so that you had the motorway, the visible event which identified what lay alongside it, through which you passed to get into the main dwelling areas. But the pattern is exactly the same as in the Hamburg project. The basis of the 650 meter spacing being that 3 takeoff to the mile, a standard American practice for downtown areas, the minimum that the geometry of the takeoff itself allows. This produces a pattern of feeder streets, 650 meter intervals, with a maximum walking distance of 300 meters from the public transport line, which was assumed will run along these feeder streets. The design of the motorway takeoffs is intended to invite traffic onto the motorways for all but local journey. The feeder street net is kept as open as possible. At the nodes in this net, that is away from the motorway, are located further car parks and service areas, the intention being that the centres of the superblock, which are mainly housing, will be kept as free as possible from vehicular movement by concentrating vehicular activities along the motorways or at nodes in the feeder streets. You keep them, you can bring the density down in the superblocks, the density of traffic movement. The line of this south tangential motorway runs 400 meters north of the old Marienplatz. In this project, we have the motorway. Parallel to it on the Rondell side, the parking strip, multi-level garage, and parallel to this again, a facilities building. From this facilities building, that is at right angles to the motorway, 2 long banks of low administrative offices extend south, embracing a green space in a manner similar to the Louvre. The whole, like the Louvre, intended to be realized sequentially. The scale of the operation making it possible to absorb minor, even major design changes within the general schema, providing they follow 2 lines. Inside the area enclosed by the building, there is to be no vehicular traffic. Indeed, there is to be no traffic at surface level anywhere within the superblock defined by the feeder street net. Along the motorway, the linear garage forms a shield against traffic noise on that side, and the ground of the superblock is tilted up at the edges towards the feeder streets to shelter it on the other 2 main traffic sides. In the landscape, sheltered by these devices and by the 2 long buildings, the actual rondel, the circle of the Marienplatz, was returned to its original form, that is just a disc. This lying like a large gramophone record between the 2 buildings. The rondel, this flat thing, was taken as one of the points of origin of the footpath system, which lace this rondel into the surrounding nets, like bootlaces almost, and other points picked up on the footway system are the bus stops on the feeder roads. This pedestrian system returns to the traditional geometry once it's south of the canal, where we convert the existing streets into pedestrian routes. So the diagonal mesh system is on the new site. We return to the street pattern for pedestrian ways south of the canal. So there are the 2 systems, rather as they were in the Hauptstadt, existing systems, superimposed systems. These long, low, wide offices, which were the client's requirement for this site, were considered in some detail. On the purely office floors, there was a lot of internal space without natural light for computers and filing and so on, things where you don't live all day. And the perimeter was open offices and closed offices with windows. Everything was considered as air conditioned. But on the upper floor, where the building cuts back and there are terraces, you have opening windows and so on, with sliding doors, natural ventilation. This whole form the long, low thing, stood on stilts, tall stilts, in a deep, waterless moat. To get to it, you have to cross a bridge over this moat, and the points that you enter are marked by neon-lit porticos. Having penetrated the portico, you arrive at a continuous gondola suspended under this long building and hanging in the waterless moat. Indeed, as the design recedes in time, one begins to see the whole building in terms of a zeppelin. It is a long, straight building with a gondola hung below it, hovering over this moat. And in this gondola, we could actually see through Zeppelin-type windows views out to the stilt, through the stilts, into the central green space and down into the busy service area, where there were the porte cocheres for official cars and unloading bays and so on. But the vehicle movement is reduced to a minimum because the office workers' cars, visitors' cars, are deposited in the parking garage parallel to the motorway or on one of these nodal concentrations of service areas. But because of the geometry, no entrance into the building is ever more than 300 meters from one of these car silos. It was by eliminating surface traffic, by having these almost invisible buildings, two zeppelins hovering over the moat in a very leafy plain, we hope that once the trees had grown up, the presence of the buildings, to be hardly felt at all.
So to sum up, the theme of the three German urban form projects, Berlin Hauptstadt, Hamburg Stylschub, Berlin Marienplatz, became in the broadest sense connection. A knitting up of the existing streets in a new pedestrian network as a matrix for a new aesthetic of city in Hauptstadt. Connection of each house to the district centre in Stylschub. And finally in Marienplatz, connections of events along the urban motorway.
This is a film about a plan for the center of Berlin, but it is more than that. It is a demonstration of a principle of organization which is applicable to all motorized, mechanism-served communities. Berlin is at present a divided city, so its patterns of use are not the real ones of a great metropolis. For this reason, the visual reminders of these patterns are taken not from Berlin, but from London. The key to the plan and to the concept is in patterns of movement. The motor car creates new patterns and new ways of perception. They are in themselves spectacle and also platforms for seeing from. Even pedestrian movement is subject to mechanization. Escalator handling of pedestrian traffic produces diagonal patterns of rapid, smooth movement and gives vantage points of an entirely new sort. The center of a capital city is a place of leisure as well as a place of work, a place to be enjoyed. In cities, car movement must be slow movement. One looks up, one looks down. One day a driver, the next a stroller. Each activity must be pleasurable. The points where the system for the cars and the system for the pedestrian cross are points of maximum intensity, of maximum experience of movement. The two systems build up into a distinct pattern of interconnected communication nets. This pattern extends out into the greater city and can be seen as a clearly identified part of a system of communication stretching right across Europe. At the center of the city, a great eye. Its function, a museum of technology, suspended over the crossing of two historic routes, a reminder of the former Baroque city. The pattern of the new city center is molded around its existing features, there is no attempt to reproduce historic spaces in which to embalm the remaining old buildings. They are instead revalidated by a spatial counter-geometry. For every function in the proposed city centre has been developed appropriate building types in which not only is their general organisation perfectly manifest, but they are equally obviously components of the bigger pattern, linked to its systems of communications and clarifying its all-over intention. This is a city in which every function has its own formal equivalent, which is at once recognizable for what it is. Its organization is not rigid. The attempt has been made to create an open aesthetic, capable of variation and of growth, in which change of social objectives can find an outlet. It is a city in which familiar acts of shopping, meeting and enjoying oneself, and familiar movement, walking and riding, achieve a specific poetry, and through that, significance.